All right, class, welcome to part 3 of week 7. We're going to be talking about George Berkeley and his responses to John Locke, with a few responses to both thinkers from Thomas Aquinas. Now, to jump right into this, let's see how Berkeley responds to John Locke's empiricism. So, first, his overall approach. Now, we could imagine, this doesn't actually happen, but you could imagine Berkeley saying to Locke and Newton something along these lines. Remember, this isn't a real quote, but he would say, so you believe that all of our knowledge comes from ideas that originate in experience. Well, so do I. But let's see where that belief takes us. Let's plumb the depths. Let's really get to the root of this. Now, and I don't think that you guys have been entirely consistent in your empiricism, because you believe that we can know a material world that lies beyond the scope of our experience. Now, here I think we see that Berkeley agrees with Locke, but he thinks that a consistent empiricist should hold that all we experience are actually just our ideas. Locke believed that our ideas are good representations of reality, but that they're not just our ideas. That's not all that we know, but we know the real world beyond our ideas through our ideas. But he never really seemed to prove it. So Berkeley will argue ultimately that on empiricism, real material substances are actually beyond our experience, and so they're not they're not really something that we get in our concept of what is actually real. Knowable material substances are just not going to be meaningful for us, because all we ever actually know, according to Berkeley, and Berkeley argues according to Locke as well, even though Locke wouldn't admit to such a proposition, but all we can know are our ideas about material substances and not the material substances themselves. And so he has a few main arguments here. So the main argument is it's called against the representative or the like an intermediate realism or the representative realism theory of knowledge. And here's Berkeley's argument. He says that our ideas are said to represent real material bodies in the real world. However, our ideas are the objects of our perceptions. So we only know our own objective ideas and the states of our minds. So we can only access those things because that's what the first thing that we know. That's proper object of our intellect, according to an empiricist. Now, as a consequence of this, we can't actually compare real material bodies with their ideas in order to determine whether or not our ideas faithfully represent those material bodies. This is sort of like what I talked about, I think, in the first part of the lectures this week, is that if I show you a picture of my son but never show you my son himself, then you'll never be able to know whether or not that picture actually corresponds to my son, unless you just have blind trust and faith in me as somebody who wouldn't lie about such things. But with our minds, all we can say is that we have this picture of the real world and this picture of the substances and the objects of the material world that are supposed to represent the real world. But again, I never see the real thing in itself. But always it's going to be some sort of intermediary, which is going to be my idea of the real substance. In the same way that the picture of my son is an intermediary between you and my actual son, not just a picture of him. So, therefore, according to Berkeley here, we have no knowledge of material bodies whatsoever. And it's a fiction that helps us maybe feel better, but really we're kind of just locked inside of our minds. And from this, we can see, I think, a pretty good description of what's going on in the representationalist or what was the other name I called it? The representative or representational theory perception. So when we have the mind here, let's see, is my pointer showing up? Yeah. We have the mind here, and the mind can only see the idea. It's the idea, which is supposed to represent the object. But what we can't see, according to the empiricist, is the object itself without having to have this intermediate state. And what we're aware of here directly is our sense data. And so we might see a tree that's fallen in the woods, but that's just what we're receiving in our sense data. We don't know what's actually behind that. We can't really quite say that, we're not justified quite yet, according to Berkeley, in saying that, so I see all the various accidents and various qualities which I interpret or call or define a tree that's fallen in the woods, but I can't actually affirm that that's the reality behind the sense experience that I'm having right now. Now, the main argument against, this represents the main argument against the representational theory of knowledge, um, which is that we don't, again, have the direct experience of the object or any direct access to it at all. And if we can't access it, then how do we know that my idea accurately represents the object that I think I'm perceiving? So moving on here, the argument from mental dependence, the mental dependency of ideas. This is another argument that Berkeley puts forward against empiricism, and these include several objections to prove that empiricism leads to simply nothing but a pure idealism, and that all of our knowledge ultimately will have to be subjective if we follow empiricism, and drink the cup of empiricism to the bitter end. Now, the first one here is the arguments of the dependency of ideas, where he says that the sensible objects are things in our sense experience. If an object is not able to be present in sense experience, then it is not a sensible object. However, what is present to us in sense experience consists solely of our ideas, which is perfectly in line with what Locke says. Now, think about it. Sensible objects are the things that can be present in us, or be present to us in sense experience. And if it cannot be anything else, then it is not a sensible object. So if it can't be present to our senses, then it is not a sensible object. So if the definition of whatever it is in front of us cannot be presented to our sensible our sense experience, then it is not something in itself which could be possibly experienced by us, and therefore we wouldn't be able to have any ideas of it through empiricism, through the strict model of empiricism. So now, what is presented to us about sensible things is ultimately going to be only our ideas, and these ideas are only things that exist in our mind, or things that exist in our mind only. So these ideas exist in my mind. Where does my idea of an apple exist? Right? In my mind. That's about it. So therefore, Berkeley concludes sensible objects solely exist, or exist solely in our minds, rather, so that all the sensible objects exist only in our minds, and our ideas only exist in our minds. Therefore, our knowledge of the material world must be purely subjective. Why? Well, because if our ideas and if our knowledge is only about what we specifically know in our own minds, and not about the real objective world, of the real objects in the world outside of our minds, which would be the same for everybody, presumably, then all we have are our own subjective ideas about the objects, which may or may not correspond to reality. And each of us being individuals, having different and distinct ideas about the objects in the world, and distinct experiences of those objects in the world, we would only have our ideas of those things present only to us. And so what that would mean is that all knowledge is ultimately subjective. Now, this becomes a real problem for the concept of materialist substances, because if we can't actually come to know the substances that lie underneath the perceptible qualities of the things in the real world, which our ideas are supposed to represent, then we can't sense those substances, and can only sense the secondary qualities, or primary qualities, then it's not the substances that we're perceiving, and so we can't say that we ever know that there is such a thing as substance, but only that we know that there's secondary qualities at best. But even there, all the various qualities, both primary and secondary, that we receive in our sense percept and our idea of the things in the real world belongs only to us, and so that's going to become subjective, and it eliminates the possibility of an empiricist knowing that substances are a thing in the real world and not just a figment of our minds. Now, how does this play out for material substances? Well, for example, remember, an apple is a complex idea, and it's considered to be a material substance, right? And our idea of an apple consists in things such as, like, it's round, it's red, hard, crunchy, sweet, and so on and so forth. But again, these are just simple ideas in our mind. So if we take away these simple ideas, what is left of the apple? Well, nothing. And here it seems because there's nothing else out there that I can actually know. The apple consists of its roundness, its crunchiness, its sweetness, and so on, but these are just simple ideas that only exist in my mind. If I take away all these things, then there's nothing left of the apple in the material world, since, according to Locke's bare particular substance theory of bare particulars regarding substance, um, that bare particular is not among the things that are made present to my mind as a sensible object. So I only know the qualities, again, what we just talked about a second ago. I only know the qualities that are sort of pinned onto the bare particular that I call an apple. And we have therefore no justification to say that there are any material substances beyond the qualities that we perceive. And so the empiricist, if he follows his ideas, especially like the Lockean empiricism, follows his ideas to the end, it seems like he can't have any knowledge about material substances. Now, Berkeley has another argument. This one is from pain and pleasure. Now, consider your experience of some quality, whether it be a temperature, a taste, or an odor. This experience usually or almost always involves some sort of pleasure or pain, and according to the Berkeleyan sense, and even just a very mild pleasure or mild pain. For instance, I have an itchiness on my head, and that's uncomfortable, right? But I want to itch it because it's something I want to get rid of. Or if I'm hungry, I feel that hunger, but again, that's something that's uncomfortable. Or if I am sitting by a warm fire, the fire is comfortable and it's relaxing and it's calming to me, and I want to stay by that fire, so it's because it's something that's pleasant. And this is something that doesn't exist in the objects of the real world, and it's not a material thing that we it's not a material thing in the sense of, like, you can't find pain in the real world. Remember, I used to go to these things called meetups in my area, where we'd just have a bunch of folks get together and we all were philosophically oriented, and we would talk about things like stuff like the existence of God, or the immateriality of the soul, or the nature of God, or whatever, various topics, sola scriptura, I mean, just tons of different things. And I don't remember the exact context of the conversation, but I think I was talking to a materialist. He was an atheist, and I asked him, and we were talking about our experiences and about how there's something to what's called qualia, which is the subjective experience of the various qualities of the things that we find in the real world, like my experience of redness and my experience of pain or pleasure isn't something that's quite material, or it's not reductive to something that's purely material. And he challenged me on this, saying, okay, well, it's something it's reducible to the chemicals in your brain. I'm like, no, that's not quite it either. You can say that these are the molecules that are associated with the pain that we experience, but with that, like, you could give me a bowl of those molecules and I'm not gonna feel the headache that I have. You can't give me like a bowl of pain soup and say it's all that pain is in there. That's not what you're finding. You're finding the chemicals. You're finding only the chemical composition compounds that are associated with pain and certain neurons firing in your body and in your brain. And that's it. That's all you have. You're not actually having you're not having the subjective experience of pain as something that you've mixed together in a centrifuge or boiled in a pot and now served to me for lunch. That's not something you're going to give. You can't get that kind of thing. This guy was a reductive materialist. He thought everything could be reduced to matter, but there were at least a few things, I think our subjective experiences are among them, which don't really seem to be something that can be grasped in the same way that something like a thing's chemical properties could be. In any case, so the pain and pleasure that we experience, all these external objects, only exist in the perceiver, and they're not something that's accessible to anybody else. You might see certain reactions, like, basically when we talk about the different parts of the brain lighting up in response to a sensation, it's essentially no different from me yelling "ow" when I stub my toe, or me saying when I eat something delicious. It's just another sign that something is going on, that I'm having some sort of experience, but it's not the experience itself. And this is something that guy wasn't really understanding, is that he was mistaking the sign for the thing. He was mistaking the sign for the signified. So the sign is the the ouch, the exclamation, in our ordinary experience. But then when you look at things like neurobiologically or whatever, it's the firing up of this area of the brain and the electrical activity that goes on there. And so and that's the sign of the experience. But each of us, if we reflect on our own experience, it's not the same thing. It's just not the same thing to have the experience of pain or pleasure. And this is something that is not accessible to anybody else. You might see it through some sort of representation, but to actually access the individual's experiences is not something that's open to you, beyond yourself. It's only open to each individual. And so, because pain and pleasure is not something that is possible to that is possible to be accessed externally to oneself, or to be beyond your own subjective experience, then it's not something that is a connection that is actually in the real world, and it's not something that can be received through sense experience either, according to Berkeley here, because as he says here, therefore quality Q, whatever that turns out to be, so my experience of eating a delicious steak, whatever that turn is, it's not the property of the external object. So my experience of that delicious steak, the deliciousness, only exists when it's being perceived. And so things like pain and pleasure can only exist insofar as I perceive them. And that means that they're in my mind and not in the world outside of my mind. Now, what this would mean is that pain or pleasure, which is a part of our experience of the qualities of the real world, are the result of material things. But since these qualities, whatever they turn out to be, these experiences of the qualities, these would be secondary qualities for the moderns, but they're only subjectively in me and not in the real world. And so there's no reason to think that there are material bodies in the real world. And the reason, again, for this is because material bodies, whenever we experience them, always come with some degree of pleasure or pain. But since pleasure or pain or our interpretation of those experiences are ultimately something that's purely subjective and can't be projected back onto the real world, as pleasure or pain. The rock I stub my toe on isn't pain or pleasure. It's my experience of pain or pleasure that is elicited by the rock. That experience does not exist in the real thing, and no matter what it is, sitting down, standing up, feeling a gentle breeze, whatever. These are things that only exist in me, but because that's what's given to me in the senses, some small bit of pleasure or pain, then the other parts of our experience of those things, our sensible experience of those things, are also not going to be something that's objective to objectively existing in the real world. Now, here's an objection. So he said, the Lockean might say heat is an external object, and while pain is a subjective consequence of it. And so we could say that a pan or a stove is hot, and it's hot whether or not I'm experiencing pain with it at all. But if I touch it, then it's a result of my touching of the stove that I whip my hand back and scream or whatever. And so we can have an experience of a real objective thing in the world, and which is namely that it's hot, but the subjective experience of that pain is still present, and we can do both without losing either. The Berkeley would respond to this simply by saying that we can't separate heat, pain, and pleasure in this way, because heat is always experienced either as pain or as pleasure, and therefore heat is pain or pleasure in us. And I therefore think, and therefore it is subjective, and therefore not a thing in the real world, because whatever is in the real world outside the mind is going to have to be something objective. And this is because all these experiences that I have are just in me. Now this would be the same thing for any other subjective quality that we experience in the real world. I'm not sure that I buy this argument. I think it's actually kind of terrible, or this reply. Because he's saying that because we always experience pain or pleasure, no matter what the degree is, whenever we have some sort of experience with the thing in the real world, that our experience of the thing is identical to the thing itself. I think that this is it's a post hoc hic fallacy, or hic post hoc fallacy, where basically you're saying every time this happens, this happens after it or in conjunction with it. Therefore, every time we have A, we have B. Therefore, B is A. But that doesn't follow. That's not going to lead to a logical conclusion. Every time that there's thunder, there's lightning, but thunder isn't the same as lightning. It's just a consequence of it. And so I don't think that Berkeley here is making a very good counter argument to the way that a Lockean would respond, or somebody who's an empiricist, whether they be an extreme empiricist or a moderate empiricist, would reply. So I don't think Berkeley's argument here works. All right, his next argument is from the perceiver, from perceiver relativity. Okay, so let's consider a quality like coldness. Quality, we're going to call it quality Q1. So this is perceived, and when we experience an object like water under conditions C1, we'll call it, which is going to be a warm hand, I will feel cold. My hand will feel the water will feel cold because my hand is warm and I touch water that's like even just room temperature, which isn't terribly cold, but it's still going to feel cold in comparison to the subjective experience of my hand. Now, when we have quality Q2, which is going to be heat in the situation, is perceived when experiencing the object of water under my condition a cold hand, or C2. So it's a different situation when I have hot water. So the hot is the quality, water is the object of is the object which has the quality, and under the condition of when I have cold hands, the water is going to feel very hot because of the extreme difference between my my cold hands and the hot water, which is backwards. Or even if we do it back, if we have the cold water and I have it and I have very cold hands, I just came in from outside and I didn't have gloves on, and it was winter and I was making a snowman with my son. My hands are going to be freezing cold. Lukewarm water is going to feel very warm, or even room temperature water is still going to feel very warm. It's going to heat my hands up a bit, and so my condition is always going to be my experience of things is always going to be conditioned upon the mode of reception that I have as an individual. And so what he says from here is that the water being experienced by me as cold, or somebody else who might be experiencing as hot, well, the water can't be both, because hot and cold are contrary opposites. And so the water is either hot or it's cold. But since we're both experiencing it subjectively and differently, then it must be the case that it's not in the water itself, but it's only the things in our minds. And so now Berkeley is going to go on to say a little bit more. And he has this question, and this is a very Berkeleyan question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, you might think it's loud, and I might think it's really quiet. So between the two of us, it's a sensory perception issue. Or somebody who has a sensory perception disorder. This is something that I have ADHD out the wazoo, by the way, guys. In case I haven't noticed yet or I haven't told you, ADHD is something that I have struggled with for most of my life, and it's not something I've really worked on dealing with effectively until the last 2 or 3 years here. And one of the little known things about ADHD is it's not just not just an issue that affects your ability to pay attention. No, you actually have a rather profound ability to pay attention. It's just managing the attention. And a consequence of that, because I pay attention to everything. I pay attention to everything. So everything's in my mind, but it's a matter of focusing on one thing, and cutting out all the distractions and keeping that attention focused. When I can do that, or vice versa, when I do the ADHD superpower, something called hyperfocus, where I zoom into some particular subject or piece of work that I'm doing, and I cannot hear other things around me. I get into almost like a tunnel vision. I get in the zone, and I can produce an incredible volume and quality of work. Now I don't always get to choose when I enter into that kind of mindset, but that's kind of what's going on with ADHD. It's not just an attention deficit disorder, but rather it's more like an attention management disorder. So we have a very difficult time managing those things. And one of the consequences of that is that certain sensory input can be very different for me in terms of my experience of it than what it might be for somebody else. Like a bathroom fan, for instance, is mind destroying for me. I can't think. I can't really do a whole lot. I get brain fog. It's easier for me to forget, and so on and so forth. And now it might not actually be all that loud in terms of the decibel level or whatever, and somebody else might not be bothered by it at all. But if we have our dehumidifier down here in the basement, or if the bathroom fan's on, I just can't be by it because it makes it so hard for me to concentrate on anything, and it puts me in a bad mood. And this can actually be affected on whether or not I got good sleep the night before, if I'm tired, if I'm feeling depressed that day, or a whole host of other things. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in me because my brain structure is a little bit different. Is a little bit different from people who are neurotypical. That is, people who are non-ADHD in this case. And so the way that I receive or hear something like a fan, or even something as stupid as like the balance and ratio of a fork. I mean, like, for some reason, if I don't have the right balance and ratio of a fork or a spoon, it just bothers me. And this isn't an unusual thing for people who suffer from ADHD. Now, all this obviously constitutes very minor suffering. But in either case, for me, the sound of a fan is a minor suffering. For somebody else, like my wife, for instance, it could be something that's comforting. She used to fall asleep to a fan when she was younger, and so now it's easier for her to fall asleep when there's a fan going. Or when she's listening to the white noise, but white noise drives me up the wall. Now, according to Berkeley, if this is the case, then there's nothing in the real world that makes sounds, because the way that we're perceiving these sounds and the way that we experience these sounds is necessarily connected to the sound itself. And if there's nobody there to perceive the sound, then there's no sound made at all. Now, another argument, and I think that there's some problems with that argument as well. One would be like, I think that it's a mistake in general to discount our experience as a part of reality, because it's just as real to each one of us. And I think in a way, our experiences as humans it tends to be much more common than not common, across cultures, even. And since that's the case, I mean, I think that does point to at least to some extent an objective human nature that's there regardless of what you think about it. But I also think that we can't discount our experience of the real world as something that our experience of our own subjective reception of the real world as something that we need to throw out in order to say in order to get to the real world, because our reception of it is based on our particular disposition. And if we have a disposition that is, such and such, that's just another factor into our consideration about how the world actually is, and whether or not we need to overcome certain limitations or reconsider the way that we're perceiving things. Still, I think that there's something to our own experience of the world that cannot be disregarded. And so where Berkeley says there's no sound, well, yeah, okay, there's no sound in one way, meaning there's no experience of sound, and there's no sound another way, which would be the motion of waves through the air or some such thing. The motions of waves through the air are there whether or not somebody experiences them. But the sound, in terms of like us actually hearing something, is there only if we're experiencing it, because there's a subject who is there who's properly disposed to receive the sound waves precisely as sound. All right. Second one here. So here's for Berkeley, we also need to talk about the way that he attacks or understands the primary and secondary qualities distinction. He thinks they're inseparable. So one objection to the relativity argument that we just talked about is to point out that there is a difference between primary and secondary qualities, which we've talked about before. And since primary qualities are objective, remaining consistent from perceiver to perceiver, whereas the secondary qualities are subjective and vary as much as perceivers vary, thus there must at least be some primary qualities that adhere in bodies. But Berkeley responds by arguing that primary qualities and secondary qualities are actually indistinguishable. So in the mind, whenever we experience so-called primary qualities and secondary qualities, they cannot be separated in the mind because they always appear together and are always perceived in the same way. Therefore, if one is mind-dependent, then the other one will be. But we have shown that secondary qualities are mind-dependent. Therefore, primary qualities are mind-dependent. The main point here is that we can only know primary qualities through the medium of secondary qualities. Let's take a concrete concrete example of a subjective secondary quality. So scent is a subjective secondary quality. Now, it's well known in my house that I can hardly smell at all, but my wife can actually find hidden things with her sense of smell. It's actually terrifying. She's like a bloodhound. So if there's like an old chicken nugget or something that slipped into the floorboards of our radiator system, then at one point it's going to start rotting and decaying or smelling bad or getting scorched or burned by the heat of the what do you call it? The heat of the radiator. Now, I might never ever smell this, but my wife will know exactly where it is, what it is, and where it is, and she'll know it very quickly. Well, how do I ever know that I know where it is? Well, I ask my wife. That's how, and and it's because she came to smell it. Could she smell this thing if it wasn't made out of biological matter and subject to decay? Well, no. Could she know that it's rotting without smelling it, touching it, hearing, or tasting, or seeing it? Well, no, of course not. And so these, the quality of the touch, the smell, the fact that it's made out of biological matter and is subject to decay, these are things, the smelling, the seeing, the touching, and so on and so forth, tasting, we wouldn't taste a rotting chicken nugget. These are things that are secondary qualities, but it's only through those secondary qualities that we find the primary qualities. And so because the secondary qualities transmit, or are supposed to transmit, the reality of the primary qualities, but those secondary qualities are only something that's perceived in my mind, and that I don't actually perceive the primary qualities in themselves, sans the secondary qualities, then it's the case that what I know about the primary qualities is also something that is only a perception. And so to summarize, if all of my secondary qualities are, if all of my perceptions secondary qualities are simply perceptions and they're subjective, but the only way that I can access primary qualities is through my secondary qualities, then it must be the case that primary qualities are also subjective, because the qualities are supposed to be a bridge for my knowledge of primary qualities. But if that bridge is imaginary and not real, then how can I get there? I can't get across the river. Or whatever, the gulf between my mind and reality in order to access reality, if my only access to reality is something that doesn't have anything that I can stand on. All right. So how does Aquinas respond to representative realism? So we just talked about Berkeley's general criticism of Locke's empiricism, which is basically to say that because any secondary qualities are the only bridges to primary qualities of real objective objects, then all of our knowledge of primary qualities are likewise subjective. And the consequences of this is this: if all secondary properties of bodies only exist in the mind and not in reality, then we can only leave behind the primary qualities. But since we can only know that material qualities have primary qualities through our knowledge of of secondary qualities, then we have no reason at all to suppose that material bodies have either have primary qualities, or that they even exist at all. So if the empiricist wants to strip reality of all secondary qualities, then we're going to have to strip it of primary qualities too, because primary qualities are every bit as subjective to our ideas of secondary qualities as our idea of secondary qualities. And so what do we do here? How do we respond to this? Well, we need to reject representative idealism. And this is because if we do not know the real world, if we do not know directly know the real world and only an idea, then we only know our ideas. So, and St. Thomas talks about this, I think, in the second part of the Summa, question 93, where if all we know are the phantasms, then, which is essentially what the percept is for Locke, if all we have are the phantasms and no access to the real world directly, then what happens is that we have a situation where every person's perception is going to be true. Whatever one person says is just as true as what anybody else says, and so all truth becomes relative. But what's worse, or what's also true about this, is that the sciences that study the way that the world is supposed to move, with physics and in biology and in basically anything else that's supposed to be about the real sensible world, is ultimately going to be reduced to the science of psychology or logicism. Why? Simply because our ideas are not about the objects themselves, but only about our ideas. So our ideas are only about our ideas about the real world, and not about the things in themselves. We don't have any access to the world that's out there, of which we're supposed to be having these various sensations. Now, Aquinas is simply not willing to accept that all sciences are instances of psychology. It's not just our ideas that we study. And so he holds that reality, not our ideas, is the direct object of knowledge. And so now Aquinas simply holds that we do not start philosophy or science with an analysis. That if we do not start philosophy or science with an analysis of the real world rather than our minds, then we're never going to get anywhere. And so the way that St. Thomas, I think that the way that we respond to this, and I think this is a good response to Kant as well, which we'll talk about later, is that there's sort of a crossroads that you come to as a philosopher that is almost impassable. I think one is much more likely than the other, which is going to be direct realism rather than indirect realism or idealism or the Kantian transcendental realism, which is just idealism by another. It's just idealism with extra steps. Is that you get to the point where you have to say either my ideas about the real world correspond to the real world to some extent because they're caused by the real world to some extent, and that I have access to reality, or that my ideas about the world only are only about my ideas about about my ideas. So I either know my ideas first and only, or I know the world first, but I also know my ideas as coming from the world. And you kind of come to this crossroads and you sort of have to choose one. And it's not based on pure voluntarism, but you're kind of getting at the point where you're hitting philosophical bedrock. It's nearly impossible for us to overcome certain objections we'll talk about with Kant, because he just paints himself into he paints the world in such a corner, and that it's not something that we're going to be overcoming anytime soon, because we if we don't start with the assumption that that we can even possibly have some connection to the real world, or that we get our ideas from the real world, then we will never be able to access that world anyway. And so at some point you sort of just have to make the intellectually informed choice to either choose to be an idealist or choose to be a realist. And I think that that comes through study and experience, and then and I think that people like Garrigou-Lagrange and other philosophers have shown that denying that we know the real world will ultimately come to a some sort of denial or near denial of the principle of non-contradiction. So it makes it much more unlikely, it makes it much more unlikely for us to say that we can be pure idealists, like Kant, or like Berkeley here, and that it's better for us to move on with philosophy and say that we can actually know the real world, because if we do that, then all we're doing is we're studying our own minds. So we reduce all sciences to logic and psychology. Whereas if we take the realist approach, a la St. Thomas and others in his tradition, and those before him like Plato or Aristotle and so forth, then we can actually get on saying that we're actually knowing things and discovering things about the real world. Now, how about St. Thomas Aquinas on substance? Let's talk about that for a second here. So Aquinas, for Aquinas, substance is not some bare substratum apart from accidental qualities. And now this is the case because if substances were a bare substratum, then any given substance would be exactly the same as another. So if you have a pincushion and you have like 1,000 pincushions, but they all just have different pins in them, well, all the pincushions are the same kind of pincushion, so they're all the same kind of thing. It's just that their accidental qualities are different. But substances, rather, on the Thomistic view, are real things in the real world. And it's not like there's something distinct, or some distinct thing that hides behind the qualities that unites them. Instead, we rather see we don't experience the accidents first and then the substance, but we experience substances by bumping into them. We understand that there's this thing in front of us in a very vague way. And it's not so much that we experience we experience the subject directly, and it's because the substances are causing the accidents, and the accidents flow forth from them. When we talk about proper accidents, things that belong precisely to the substance in itself, the substance produces the accidents rather than having them pinned in there. And these accidents are not, and what they are is they're not like external things in every case, that are getting poked into this bare substratum. No. They're not, the substance and the accidents aren't two things. They're not separable from each other. My hair and its redness aren't, that you can't pull them from each other. The only way my hair is the redness of my hair could exist is if it's in the hair. But at the same time, my hair couldn't exist without some color. And so while it's the case that my hair is something that is, that can remain the same between various changes in color, it can't exist without color of some kind. And so they're not two different distinct substances or things that are intelligent, and even though they're intelligible from they're intelligibly distinguished from one another, and they can be distinguished by one continuing to subsist where the other one where the other one cannot without the other. And this is because accidents are just modifications of how a particular substance exists at any given moment. For instance, I'm sitting, or when I'm standing, or if I have a hairy face, or if I go bald, or if I feel warm or cold, or whatever it might be. It's the substance that exists. But the accidents aren't just like little pins that come in from the outside somehow, but rather there's something that kind of like bubbles up and flow and comes from within me, either as a spontaneous action that comes from the powers of my own essence, actively speaking, or passively speaking when something affects me. So when I have the heat on the house, I start sweating. Well, do I sweat to cool my body off when there isn't any environmental factors? Well, maybe occasionally if I have a fever or something like that. But for the most part, it's going to be something that's happening outside of me or from exercising. Either way, there's something going on. My body's receiving to some sort of responding to some sort of stimulus, and now the substance of myself is acting in a certain way. Some accidents, I'll note, are such that if the substance doesn't have them, then it wouldn't exist at all. For example, humans, I couldn't exist without at least the potential for the proper accident of rational activity. This is a proper accident. My clothes that I'm wearing, those are an accident, and I will continue to wear them for various legal reasons, at the very least. But for now, if I were not rational, if I didn't have the capacity for reason, even potentially, then I wouldn't be human. And it's the same thing. I wouldn't even be a person or human person if I didn't have a body, or if I didn't have a functioning heart. These are certain proper activity or proper accidents that cannot be separated from the substance itself. And so for St. Thomas, substances aren't hidden behind some sensible quality, and the reason for this is that he doesn't take a deflated view of sense experience as a strict empiricist would. Instead, Aquinas doesn't think that we feel a patch of brown, feel a fuzzy texture and a bad smell, and put these ideas together and call it a dog. Instead, St. Thomas holds that what we have in sense experience is much richer, more profound, deeper than that. What we experience is a particular being, even if we don't know what that substance is yet. We don't know, even if we don't know what that being is yet. However, because we encounter substances and the essence of like a dog in a sense experience, it's the substance or essence that's passed on to our intellect, not the accidents. And the substance is not hidden beneath the accidental qualities known by our senses. But we do know that we do sense substances and we do sense essences, just not in the way that the intellect grasps these things. And so the senses and the intellect grasp the exact same thing, but in a different way. Substances are simply the natural organizational unities of parts, and essences are the way in which those parts are related to one another and for the sake of the whole. And so it's not that our senses don't understand or grasp substances and essences. It's just that the intellect does, and it's the way that they do it differently. The senses understand the essences and substances in a particular manner, whereas the intellect understands it in a universal manner. Now, this is possible because Aquinas doesn't take the modernist assumption that the world is really two substances, or that humans are really two substances, which is an extended thing and thinking things, the very Cartesian view of the world. Rather, his hylomorphic approach to reality, which is saying that the human being is a form matter composite, which are two principles of the same thing. Your form is not a different thing than your body, but they're not the same. But they're not the same actuality, or they're not the same reality either. So in any material thing, for Aquinas, you have the principle of act and you have the principle of potency. The principle of potency in a human being is the body. The principle of actuality is the soul or the form, and this is going to be true for a dog, for a cat, for a mouse, or whatever. Or if you even think about it simply something like an accidental substance or an artifact, and you find a table. The table is not just the shape of the table, the arrangement of the parts, but it's also the parts. It's both things. It's both considerations taken together. And so the form and the body are just one thing, but they have different powers and they're different ways of contributing to the overall substance and to the overall thing that you're talking about. And so the soul organizes all the material parts of the body, your skin, your nails, your hair, your digestive system, your brain, whatever, for the sake of some unified action, which is the thriving of what it means to be a human being. And because for Aquinas, there's only one thing, the human person, and there's no hard distinction between the person's mind and their body, meaning that there are not two substances, but rather just one substance. Then what happens with the body and what happens in the mind is communicated through the whole. And this relates to our senses, because when we receive a particular sensible form individually through the senses, the intellect takes that exact same experience, that exact same form, or the exact same reality, and then digests it according to its own way of processing the experiences that we have, which is going to be in a universal and abstract sense. And so the senses and the intellect grasp the exact same object, but in different ways. And so when we experience a dog, what the senses get is barky, stinky, brown, or happy thing, but the intellect says this dog, Fido, which gives us a representation, knowing that we have our idea or a picture of the dog that's in front of us, that we can store for later recall and to remember the dog's name or whatever, but also because we also know that this represents the real dog in reality. And so the universal with a singular thing like this dog Fido is the essence, which belongs both to Fido that exists in the real world and Fido as it exists in my mind, as my idea. And so it's the same essence that's subsisting or is actuated by an active existence in the real world and an active existence in my mind, where in the active existence in my mind, the matter is like my brain, or like the arrangement of the neurons in my brain to recall that image, and all the different like images that I have and the colors and whatnot that I perceive in my own imagination. But the matter that it subsists in or the matter that the essence is instantiated in the dog in the real world is doggy flesh and doggy bone, doggy sinew. And their active existence is different because the active existence in the dog outside my mind is real active existence, whereas the active existence in my mind of Fido, precisely the same thing, is a mental active existence. But the essence itself is neutral to both, whether it be real or mental existence. And so, the way Aquinas would talk about this is he wouldn't deny this. He would deny the deflated view of sense experience that the modernists seem to have, and say that we experience the real world in all of its glorious richness, and all the different qualities, and that because we are not two different we're not two different distinct things, a mind and a body that somehow interact. But rather we are one thing with a mind and a body, which are united precisely because they belong in that same substance. We do receive the reality of the world through our senses first, but our mind also receives that same reality, but just in a different way. Or or the mind interprets it or understands it in a way that the senses do not. And so we have access to the real world. We have knowledge of the world outside of our minds. And I think that's a much better explanation for the success of the sciences and for our ability to reason about the world in general. Okay, now that's enough for now. I'll see you guys in the forums, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye.